So I think it's right on 1 o'clock, so I think we'll begin, but no doubt there'll be a few more people to join us. So hi everyone, and welcome to today's consultation session. This is the first of 2 workshops being run by the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance, or Acta, on research prioritisation. Thank you for joining us. My name's Paul Scuffin. I'm Director of the Menzies Health Institute here at Griffith University, and I'm a member of Acta Research Prioritisation and Impact and Implementation Reference Groups. It's also a pleasure to bring you this work on behalf of Acta. I'm joined today by Professor Rachel Morton, Professor Paul Hanson, and Associate Professor Haitham Tafaha. We'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today, and to our brothers in New Zealand across the ditch. Thank you. A few housekeeping rules. Firstly, I'm sure everybody's used to Zoom by now, but if you put yourself on mute and turn off your camera during the presentations would be appreciated. And we encourage you to use the chat function throughout this session. So please post your questions for speakers in the chat box. We'll collate these questions and read them out at the end. We'll attempt to address as many as we can in the time we have, and I will present these questions to the speakers in the Q&A session at the end of the workshop. And just also to flag to you that this is being recorded. Next slide, please. And Acta, what is Acta? And thank you everyone for joining. So Acta is the peak body, as you can see there. It was established in 2014 to connect and support 3 core member groups: the Clinical Trials Network, the Clinical Trial Coordinating Centres, and the Clinical Quality Registries. We are the contact point for this across the sector as a common voice. Within these 3 organisations, there's more than 10,000 clinician researchers, research teams and consumers that make research happen. So today's research prioritisation workshop, I'm going to hand over to Rachel Morton and starter. So Rachel is Professor and Director of Health Economics and now the Deputy Director of the Clinical Trials Centre at the NHMRC Clinical Trials Centre, Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. She specialises in trial-based and modelled economic evaluation and elicitation of preferences using discrete choice experiments. Her research incorporates patient-centred and economic outcomes into clinical trials of diagnostic tests, new treatments and models of care to facilitate policy decision-making on the basis of cost effectiveness. She's also an Acta board member. So welcome, Rachel. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'll hand over to you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you to Acta for enabling this webinar and workshop, and a very kind introduction as well. The Research Prioritisation Group has been something that's been very close to my heart for the last 3.5 years. And with my co-chair of this group, Haitham Tafaha, and other members, we've really been able to develop, I think, some useful tools and criteria, reference documents in order to enable a more transparent approach to research prioritisation. So this slide that you can see here is the new framework, and I'm presenting it up front, and then I'll repeat it at the end of this talk, so that you can see and appreciate all of the steps in the framework for research prioritisation. And this is actually publicly available on the Acta website. So just to quickly step you through it, the new framework involves, it's a comprehensive framework, and it involves and starts with forming a leadership team.
No, ya estoy conectado.
Developing scope and objectives, identifying and engaging relevant stakeholders, then developing the selection criteria, weights for the selection criteria, and we'll be able to help you with that as well. Identifying topics and selecting them, identifying or generating the research proposals, the actual studies that will be done, and then the process of selecting them, and then to bring a close to the loop to conclude and evaluate. this prioritisation program. So this is a comprehensive map, and clinical trials networks or funders might start at a particular area in the map or may do the entire cycle. So why do we prioritise, and how do we decide which trials to do or which trials to fund? Let's assume that you're a clinical trial network focused on reducing childhood overweight and obesity, and you only had the resources to do one of the above school-based randomised controlled trials. Which one would you choose? Trial A, parenting classes of healthy eating and exercise, or on the right, trial B, stand-sit desks in school classrooms. Both have a signal that they may be effective, but you need more data. But what criteria would you use to enable your decision? And that's the sort of thing we're going to cover. So why prioritise? We know that prioritisation is extremely important to make optimal use of resources that we have at our disposal to generate evidence to improve human health. That's our overall goal. And we also appreciate that there's an inherent opportunity cost when research does not improve decision making. So we obviously want to increase the value and reduce waste. And some of the principles that are listed here have been nicely spelt out in a Lancet series. We have limited resources. We need to make optimal use of those resources. And a guide to whether clinical research is useful, which may also be of interest, was published by John Ioannidis a few years ago and contains some of the following questions that are always good to ask yourselves. Is there a health problem that is big enough or important enough to fix? Has prior evidence been systematically assessed? Is the proposed study large enough or long enough to be sufficiently informative? Does it reflect real life? Does it reflect top patient priorities? Is it patient-centred? Is the research worth the money? Is it feasible? Can this research actually be done? And then are the methods, data and analyses verifiable and unbiased in terms of the study design that's chosen? So the Acta Research Prioritisation Group set about as its goal was to develop tools and criteria to support clinicians, trialists, clinical trial networks and funders to help in the prioritisation process. And the goal was to ensure that trials conducted by networks identify research questions with the greatest possible impact for health outcomes. And specific objectives were to develop and disseminate best practice guidelines for prioritisation of trials by CTNs, and also that were applicable to funders. So the next couple of slides really tease out the prioritisation at two levels. There's the prioritisation of topic generation. So for example, if you were running a perinatal trials group, the topics might be stillbirths, reducing stillbirths, caesarean sections, how to reduce caesarean sections, or postnatal depression. So they are the topics, and prioritisation can be done at the topic selection stage. And then once the topics have been prioritised, then the specific research proposals can be prioritised. So for instance, if stillbirths was a prioritised topic, then there might be different interventions within different trials or proposals that could be then prioritised and selected for either working on grant applications, developing up the concept a bit further and submitting for funding. So for instance, to reduce stillbirths, you could have a proposal of side sleeping, or another proposal around frequent ultrasound monitoring. So within the Research Prioritisation Group, we undertook 3 key activities. The first was a pragmatic review of published literature from research organisations and funders conducting trials about how they prioritise trials. And that's currently under review at the moment, although we presented the results at the NHMRC Translation Symposium a couple of years ago. We also undertook a survey and interviews of current prioritisation approaches among Acta's 43 clinical trial network members. And we also undertook some broader stakeholder consultation. And the idea was to ensure that the framework that we developed or modified was fit for purpose for the Australian context. What did our pragmatic review find? From 746 studies that were initially identified, we screened and included 68 of those. And within the 68 studies, we found that there were three main approaches to research prioritisation. The first was a consensus-based approach that we called the interpretive approach, that involved a lot of people coming together to discuss until consensus was reached about topic or research proposal prioritisation, mostly topic prioritisation. There was a quantitative or metric-based approach, which typically involved burden of disease calculations and explicit awareness of gaps in knowledge to address particular burdens with specific research questions. So very much an epidemiological approach with some, a small amount that was also based on economic approaches or economic metrics, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And then the third was a combined or blended approach, which used often in sequence interpretive and quantitative components. And then within the literature, we found that there are certain comprehensive approaches or blended approaches that included, several of these components. And there's four listed here that you may have heard of. One is ENHR, the Essential National Health Research Group. One is, was quite popular actually, is the CHNRI, the Child Health and Nutrition Research Initiative. The 3D CAM, the Combined Approach Matrix, and the James Lind Alliance. And they're described here in terms of what activities they typically run and what their process is of prioritisation. We looked at rating or scoring some elements of these comprehensive approaches, such as the engagement with stakeholders. And you can see here that the James Lind Alliance scored very highly on stakeholder engagement. We then looked at transparency, and again, something like the James Lind Alliance was less clear about how the decisions were made within the consensus process. And then examination of existing evidence. So we were able to quantify, if you like, the strengths and weaknesses of each of these different approaches. Now, what we found was that quantitative approaches, including economic measures such as value of information analysis, were not commonly used, even though people thought that being able to quantify the value for money of a proposal was extremely useful in a prioritisation decision making. And what you can see on the slide here are some examples, 8 published examples in 3 countries of different applications of value of information analysis. And you're going to hear a little bit more about that today. I just want to now turn to when we stepped away from the published literature and talked to our members, what they thought was important and what they currently used. And you can see there's a whole range of criteria here across the x-axis, from burden of disease to external priorities, knowledge gaps, innovation, capacity building, end user alignment, and value for money. And most groups used most of these things. There was no ranking in terms of what was most important. It was just a collection of all the different criteria that a group might use. And we then interviewed 7 clinical trial networks that did have a research prioritisation process. And these are 6 of the themes that we found that were important. Firstly was about the governance structure of the group. And The groups differ in terms of their alignment with professional organisations, whether they're international consortiums or Australia, New Zealand, or single country, whether they're independent, companies limited by guarantee, etc. And that governance structure fed into their autonomy to prioritise, as well as some of the important factors or constraints. The actual research prioritisation process itself, often there were discipline-specific groups, involvement of consumers. Some groups had said the newer ones, they hadn't had to prioritise too much because they were able to take on all concepts and ideas and follow those through to at least grant submission. However, the annual scientific meetings was often the place where prioritisation was conducted. Number 3 was the role of the funders and specific schemes such as NHMRC or MRFF, the clinical trials and cohort schemes. The criteria, the scoring criteria of those schemes often then fed directly into the prioritisation for the groups in order to achieve fundability. Number 4 was consumer involvement, and this did vary quite a bit between groups with input of consumers through positions on the executive or the board or scientific committee. And typically consumer involvement was largest at the topic selection. Some of the challenges are resourcing the process, time-poor individuals, volunteers, limited skills within clinical trials networks about research prioritisation itself, unequal power distribution and dominating individuals within groups as well, meaning that it was more difficult to have a process rather than individual level support for applications. And finally, the criteria themselves. And when the groups told us about the criteria they used, they also communicated the trade-offs that they had to make between them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So for prioritising at the topic level, the group's mission and objectives were very important in that, in that topic selection. Often fitting with a strategic plan, often falling under specifically the name of the trials group, but also the changing landscape. And one example would be the pan-cancer trials that are broader than a particular therapeutic area. And then at the proposal level, these were some of the key factors or the key criteria. Significance, what will be the impact from this trial? Scientific quality, is there a biological or plausible mechanism? Is it the right design, effect size, sample size, etc.? Feasibility, logistically, can we actually do this trial? Fundability, is it aligned with either of the standard calls or the targeted calls for funding? For instance, is it aligned with the funders' priorities for rare cancers, mental health, etc.? Equity was an important criterion. A few groups targeted interventions for disadvantaged populations, for instance, high-risk groups or rare cancers, and others wanted to ensure that participation of disadvantaged individuals could be encouraged within the trial design. And overall importance to consumers. So many of the groups, were very strong in their passion for ensuring that their research was patient-centred, and consumers were often directly involved in the ranking or rating processes, either having an equal vote or as one in a group. There were also a few concerns about, not so much concerns, but trade-offs in terms of what might be desirable in terms of eliminating a disease or a condition, and what might actually be feasible in terms of a trial intervention to actually be able to do that. So I've summarised most of the stakeholder consultation issues here, but in addition, there were also thoughts about how to balance funding for chronic diseases versus emerging priorities. how to weight the criteria used, and we'll hear more about that, and whether all seeds should be watered and allowed to, then grow and blossom, and then the fundability, the funding success of the trial would be the ultimate determinant of whether it was a good priority or not. So given all of that information, we have then developed the Acta Criteria, and there are 5 criteria: relevance, appropriateness, significance, feasibility, and value for money. So just to define relevance, why should we do this? Including the burden of the disease, equity considerations and knowledge gaps. Appropriateness, how do we do it? And this is about the scientific rigour and the answerability of the question. The significance, what are we going to get out of it? Why do this? Including the impact of the trial, capacity building and innovation. Feasibility, can we do it? Including the team quality and research environment. Very much about trial preparedness, as well as the number of recruiting sites and feasibility for recruitment. And then finally, value for money. Is the proposed research potentially cost effective? So I'll now come back to the Research Prioritisation Framework. And you can see where all of the information we've collected now helps and fits into this framework. So forming a leadership team, deciding if you're starting out in this process, who should be involved, how, and what level of representation. Do you need CEOs? Do you need international investigators from your group or from your trial, other thought leaders? What are the aims, activities and resources of the process? This does take time, and to do it well, it does require, some dedicated resource. Identify and engage stakeholders, develop the selection criteria. What makes a question important? What value do we get? Can we do it? Is it worth it? Etc. And we've now given you some criteria to start with. We'll also be giving you an idea of weighting and scoring of those criteria. And then with the criteria, identifying topics. So considering the consumer needs, the healthcare problems, health system elements, practice variation, knowledge gaps. Selecting the topics. So that involves assessing, scoring and ranking topics using the selection criteria. Generating the research proposals. So this is inviting or developing or working up the specific questions into proposals to address the selected topics. And then the second level of assessing, ranking and scoring these proposals using the selection criteria. And finally, in concluding and evaluating, is reporting and communicating the outcomes to all of the stakeholders. And what is particularly useful is a critical review and evaluation of the research prioritisation process itself. So in summary, I'd like to say that research prioritisation is critical to make the best use of our available research resources, whether they be skilled people, whether they be skilled administrative staff, whether they be trial participants, and others, to generate high quality evidence. Prioritisation process should be carefully planned and consider the scope, objective and the resources available. And mostly it should be inclusive, transparent, practical, as well as flexible, dependent on changing needs. And we would also argue that quantitative approaches, such as value for money, should be considered to maximise the return on research investment. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We'll come to questions at the end, as previously mentioned. So now my pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Hansen. And Paul is a Professor of Professor of Economics at the University of Otago in New Zealand and co-inventor of 1000 Minds decision-making and conjoint analysis software. It's on the web as www.1000minds.com. His research interests include prioritisation, resource allocation, and especially in the health sector. Paul has been an advisor to the World Health Organization, a contractor for Google, and has worked at or consulted with New Zealand's Treasury, Ministry of Health and Pharmac. Paul's work with 1,000 Minds colleagues helping organisations around the world with their decision making makes them very happy. He also likes surfing and beer. Absolutely, so it was great to have you, Paul. And Paul was in the privileged position of having Paul as one of my PhD supervisors a couple of decades or so ago. So it's fantastic and great to meet up again. Today, Paul will speak today about how to use 1000 Minds software. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, for a lovely introduction. And haven't you done so well, surpassed my career, that's for sure. I didn't think you'd read that last sentence out about surfing and beer, but there you go, it's true. I cannot tell a lie. So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure. And thanks to Acta for inviting me, and especially the wonderful Fiona for organising so much of this talk today. Here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about, give you an overview of multi-criteria decision-making. And in fact, that's really what Rachel was talking about to a large extent in terms of the framework that she was, that the Acta team had come up with for research prioritisation. And of course, I'm going to talk about 1000 Minds as an example of software for performing multi-criteria decision-making. So a few slides about that, and hopefully I'll get through that in maybe 10 or so minutes, because I'd like to leave the last 10 or 15 minutes for a demonstration of the software. I want to show you in a practical way how the tool can be used for any sort of research prioritization application, be it prioritizing topics or research questions, or in fact, the example I think I'll do is actually rank ordering and prioritizing funding applications, and also allocating a budget, because it gives us a chance to look at everything. So just in a nutshell, this is what 1000 Minds software does. We, for the last 20 years, have been very involved in helping people with their decisions that involve, ranking, prioritizing, choosing when there are competing alternatives to choose between. And of course, that describes so many different applications. And of course, based on considering different or multiple criteria, or they're sometimes called objectives. And so the examples today are very much with the research focus. The other side of what 1000 Minds does, and it really, the two areas overlap tremendously, although they're often not treated this way, if you like, in the industry, is we do conjoint analysis or discrete choice experiments. And that's really about discovering, what's important to people when they're looking at things that they're choosing from. So, the important attributes and their relative importance. And there's sort of our vision as to what we're trying to do. It's all about trying to help people make better decisions and understand really what it is that matters when those decisions are being made. We're a team of 7, mostly based in Wellington and Dunedin, New Zealand, but also with colleagues in other parts of the world as well. We're small, but we're nimble, as we like to say. It's a wonderful group of people to work with. So multi-criteria decision-making, MCDM, is sometimes also called multi-criteria decision analysis. Don't be put off by the terminology. But as I said, it's really just ranking or prioritizing, choosing things when there's different alternatives to consider. And those alternatives could be people. A lot of our work is prioritizing patients for operations, but it's based on considering multiple criteria. And it's very much at the intersection of those 3 disciplines. I'm an economist by training, but it's been an absolute joy, of course, getting to work in sort of the area of psychology, but also computer science and operations research. Here's what we've been doing for the last 20 years in the health sector. Since 2004, pretty much any elective surgical procedure, or other types of healthcare in the New Zealand health system, patients get prioritised according to criteria. They get a score, typically out of 100, and they get booked for their operation on the basis of that. And that idea is spread to other, if you like, sort of socialised or public health type systems, including in Western Canada. I won't go through all of these, but again, disease classification, like working out if individuals who have particular symptoms have particular diseases that are oftentimes very hard to classify or diagnose, where there's lots of indicators. So our tools are used for working out their importance. Allocating health technologies, of course, subject to a budget. We've done a lot of work also in the health-related quality of life field. We've built up the EQ5D instrument for New Zealand. World Health Organization uses this for ranking diseases that are becoming antibiotic resistant, so that research priorities could be worked out and discovered internationally and resources used appropriately. And of course, research prioritization, which I'll talk to you about today. And in the last year or so, of course, certainly in New Zealand, we were saved the worst of it so far, although we're back into sort of different forms of lockdown. But if there was a shortage of ICU beds, prioritising patients for those beds was going to be a very important application. So our tools were used to create instruments for that. And you can see the web address there if you want to look at specific examples of any of those applications. So any decision that really is based on multiple criteria has really 4 key elements. And again, Rachel talked about these things in her presentation as well. You've got some alternatives that you're trying to rank or prioritize. And in this today's talk, of course, they could be research priorities or topics, questions or funding applications. And oftentimes those decisions are made subject to a budget constraint, but not always. And you're going to do that by using some criteria to evaluate and compare the alternatives that you're looking at. And those criteria are typically going to have some weights, and they're not going to be the same weights because different criteria will have different relative importances. And naturally, you want to involve decision makers who have to work out these priorities, but also potentially other stakeholders, and you want to represent those preferences. So in a nutshell, this is what multi-criteria decision making is, and this is what 1000 Minds software is a tool for doing. So here's an example, suppose, and this is sort of the one I'll run through live, but I'll just show you as an overview. So suppose we were ranking these proposals that we're thinking of funding, and we've got a limited budget, then we'd have some criteria. And you can see 4 examples, 4 criteria there, and they're somewhat similar to the Acta ones, but I chose different ones just so that we didn't steal each other's thunder. And each of these 4 criteria have a number of levels of performance. And I've made these totally generic, but of course they could be much more specific. They could be quantitative, they could be qualitative, but the key thing is we're using these criteria with their different levels to evaluate each alternative, in this case, funding application that we're looking at. And again, there's no reason why each criterion has to have the same number of levels. They can have different numbers of levels for each one. And so, it's sort of the art of multi-criteria decision making is working out what are the criteria that you want to use for the application and what are their levels and how do we describe them in ways that people who are using them can understand. And then to get the weights, so we might be able to come up with criteria, but the next question is, well, what's the relative importance? So is the scientific and clinical potential more or less important than significance, or the investigators or the approach? And if they're of different relative importance, well, how do we quantify that? What weights would we come up with? So a very common approach in this area is to ask the decision makers, or more broadly the stakeholders, a whole series of pairwise comparisons. And here's an example, and I'm going to show you this live in just a moment. So the decision maker, either on their own, perhaps like in a survey setting, or in a group, perhaps discussing things and reaching a consensus, is being asked in this example to choose between the alternative on the left, imagining that it's a funding application that they might see, and the alternative on the right, another funding application. And they're both described in the same 2 criteria, but they've got different levels of performance. And you can see, I think, quite clearly, there's a trade-off that's required. And so the person's asked to express their preference by choosing the left, the right, or say that they're equal. And this is very, very similar, it's identical really, to what's known as a discrete choice experiment. And so that's why, as far as 1000 Minds is concerned, multi-criteria decision-making and DCEs are really just opposite sides of the same coin using the same method. And a whole series of questions like this will be asked, and I'll show you to arrive at, based on those answers, the software then calculates what the weights are representing the relative importance. So on this screen here, there are the weights that came out, and if you focus on the bolded numbers, so the 44.8, the 22.1 down to 11.5, if we were to sum those, they would add to 100. And that means, of course, a hypothetical application that scored excellent on each criterion, so in other words, it was the absolute best of the best, would score a maximum of 100. At the other extreme, if something was poor, let's hope we don't see many of those, but if we did, of course, the sum, we're just adding them up. These are additive systems. The sum of all the zeros is of course 0. So everything's scored out of 100, and that's why these numbers are interpretable sort of as a percentage out of 100. But that's representing the relative importance. And the key thing is, again, there's no reason why the steps between each of the levels have to be on a linear scale. That's often done, that's what people do as a shortcut, but if you use a proper approach like this, you can get weights that have some more validity. And then we apply the weights. Okay, so here's 40, there's only a subsample here, of, say, applications that want funding. They've all been rated, they've been evaluated, and the scores are added up by the software, and here they are ranked according to their performance. And if we weren't budget constrained, that might be as far as we wanted to go. But of course, before I show you that, actually, let me just address the issue that some people often bring up. Is a common sort of query that people have is the accuracy, if you like, of such a simple system. You know, the notion that just by adding, as the software does, the scores on 4 different things and producing a score out of 100, that we're getting valid and reliable results. And this has been a subject of a great deal of investigation by psychologists, probably for the last 50 years. And just here's a couple of books, particularly this latest one by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner, that just came out this year. Talks about, you know, in decisions such as these, if you're not using tools like what I'm showing you today, there's a tremendous amount of variability in people's assessments and judgments, and he calls that noise, not surprisingly, such that you can't really have a lot of confidence if you give, you know, a group of experts the same set of things to rank. You'll get very different results. And so that's why the solution that these psychologists recommend, of course, is to try and use criteria that are explicit and that are weights. We could call these algorithms, in order to support decision making to make better decisions. And so this has been studied a lot, as you can imagine, to try and ensure that these approaches do, you know, produce valid and reliable, accurate results. Now, here's what I wanted to show you. So suppose we got the ranking like we have here, but we were budget constrained. Well, then we might want to think about, well, what's the value for money of each of these applications? So again, here's their scores out of 100 on the vertical axis. Here's the amount of money that they've requested on the horizontal. And I think most of us, our eyes would be drawn to the top left because we're getting some very, you know, high scoring applications and they're not exhausting the budget. And we could throw in other things too. The size of the bubble could give us some measure of confidence in their budgets. Maybe we could think about strategic importance by color, or we could grade them by, say, different topic areas if that was important, or geographic regions. But now we've got a method by which we can start to allocate our cash. And I want to show you this in action in just a moment. So why is multi-criteria decision-making so widely used? And it really is, not just in health, but across all areas of decision-making. Well, I won't read the slide out to you, but in essence, most human beings are more like Homer Simpson than Sheldon Cooper or Mr. Spock. We're not all as rational and able to calculate and make decisions, perhaps without the influence of emotion or tiredness or groupthink or any of those things. And in fact, psychologists, here's a sort of a nice list that they've put together that sort of summarizes, if you like, some of the common mistakes that are often made at an individual level or at a group level. Think of your own lives. Maybe you recognize some of these things in your own behavior or in perhaps the organizations that you come from. I'm a professor at a university, as I'm sure many of you are, and you know, not criticizing my colleagues, but I often would, when I was head of department, I'd come out of meetings with, say, 20 very smart and well-educated and well-meaning people. And I would wonder, you know, number 7 here, how on earth did that decision get reached? Some sort of group failure, but all of these things are very common. And so we're trying to avoid that. That's what this decision-making approach is all about. Here's just sort of a quick list of sort of buzzwords, I guess, as to some of the advantages and benefits of using these approaches. And they're all, of course, you know, pretty desirable and laudable things to try and achieve in any sort of approach. And especially when it's across, you know, decisions that matter and that are using public funds and that have real implications for people, goes without saying, I think. 1,000 Minds is one tool, but there's plenty of others. So I want to open your eyes if you haven't discovered this area before. Here's a page from Wikipedia, of course. That's us. That's the method we use, but there's plenty of others. And some of these are better and worse than others, of course. There's some really great ones, but there's also some that aren't so great. But it is a big industry worldwide with different characteristics. And so the question, I've already talked about how our system works, but the real question in all of this area, and that's what differentiates most of the methods, is how do the weights get arrived at? So I showed you some weights before that came out of our software. So how did they come about? Well, there's lots of ways that people have done this in the past. One way, of course, is just to make the numbers up off the top of your head in an arbitrary fashion. Another one is to use regression analysis. But of course, to do regression analysis, you need to have sort of an observable variable on the left-hand side, if you like. And if you don't know what the end result should be, it's very hard to run a regression against the characteristics and then work out the coefficients. So number two is very data dependent. But in essence, that's the center of big data approaches and sort of a lot of the computer sciencey approaches. But you need the data. And of course, the third method, and that's 1,000 minds, is all these methods that have arisen out of operations research and methods to try and codify people's preferences. And so there are sort of certainly 5 common ones. Paprika is the name of our method. Another very, very common one is AHP, the analytic hierarchy process used by a couple of other very big software providers. Here's just a summary of some of the IP, if you like, involved in the Paprika method that 1,000 minds uses that I co-invented with one of my colleagues in 1,000 minds when we started the company 20 years ago. Patents and publications and awards, all that sort of stuff. And I've shown you how the screens look, but the real strength of an approach like this is that it's really only asking people for rankings or ordinal measurements. It's not asking them on some, say a scale from 1 to 9, how important is one criterion versus another, or any sort of really complicated cognitive exercise that people have trouble with. Most of us have experience. You know, when I knock off tonight, my girlfriend's, I hope, going to say to me, Paul, would you like a beer? Would you like a wine? Or would you like both? That's the answer I'll give. But, you know, we're used to choosing one thing from two. It's a very common thing. And you can see there's a quote in favor of it from Michael Drummond et al., just sort of endorsing this sort of basic methodology for eliciting people's preferences. So I should now just like to show you how our software works very quickly. Oops, no, actually I don't need to open a new one, I'm already in. So here we are. So I'm in 1,000 minds. I've logged into my account. Obviously it's got a password and I've got a whole bunch of illustrative, make the screen a little bit larger, models that I can show you. And just on that note, if you get into 1,000 minds at some stage, we've got lots of examples that are available, including ones related to research that we're just going to, and lots of other areas too. Plenty in health, of course, those examples that I talked about before. So I'll go through one of the examples that I grabbed out of that set. So I'll do this one here, which was pretty similar to the screenshots I showed you before. So here's sort of my navigation here. That's me over there. And I'm going down the left-hand side navigation as well. And I won't show you everything, but basically our steps are, you know, put in some criteria. We can enter the funding application. So in this example, I want to rank, you know, applications to a funder, and we're going to allocate the resource. Of course, in other situations, you wouldn't have that budget constraint, and we're going to get some results. So here we go, the criteria. That's the screen I showed you, and of course, we can add as many things as we want to. You've seen a man clicking buttons before, I'm sure. Very, very simple. Now, of course, the question is, I'll show you this changing, you know, what's the relative importance on the weights? So currently, before we've told the software anything, the weights are all equally weighted, and you can see that represented there, and the steps between each of the levels is just a linear scale. So, you know, we could start with that, but of course, is there any reason to believe that these criteria are equally important? Well, we can find that out, and we'll come to this in just a moment. I've entered 40, I could enter 400 for all the software keys. I can bring it in with the Excel, I can export it to Excel, I can just enter them individually, and each alternative, and so these are just by number, suppose we're keeping the identity of the applicants confidential, becomes a record, and we can put a photograph if we want to, and we can put in all the information, including a full description here. So that's pretty comprehensive, but there they are, and we want to produce a ranking of those. Now, the question was, what's the weights? So the Paprika method that I talked about is going to ask us a whole series of these trade-off questions. So would I like to fund something that was good on the scientific and clinical potential side of things, but I didn't have a lot of faith in the investigators, or the opposite? Personally, I think I'd go for the right. And you can watch the progress bar. Now, another combo, 2 at a time. So pairwise comparisons of 2 things at once. So again, I won't read these out, but you can see what's going on there. So always a trade-off. So all else being equal with significance, I'd want the one on the left. But when it comes to the the merits of the approach and want the one on the right. So I'm being forced to confront a trade-off. And by answering these questions, always two at a time, I'm basically training the software as to what I think is important and revealing how important I think these things are. A nice feature, I'm not going to do it, is, but we could do this in a voting methodology. So if I sent, in fact, that link to everyone in this call, everyone could have a vote on each of these decisions and we could decide how we move forward. And if there's, of course, disagreement, oftentimes there is. And that's a good thing, by the way, because the reason we come together to work in groups is because we have different expertise, but we could have a discussion and then we could try and reach some consensus before we move on. So that gives a lot of power. And of course, the other way to do this is to send it out as a survey that 1000 Mind does too, which I'm not going to do just for interest of time. But again, always these trade-offs, always these pairwise comparisons, and it gets faster and faster because basically the software is learning what I think is important and it's only asking questions that it doesn't know the answers to. I haven't got time to explain it, but it's using a process known as transitivity. If A, the one on the left, is preferred to B, the one on the right, and then later on I'm asked about, say, B versus C, a third alternative, and I said B is better than C. If A is better than B, and B is better than C, then the software knows not to ask about A versus C. So it's making full use of that logical property. But in the process, we end up answering all the different combinations two at a time. And I won't click through these all, but you can see where this is going. So let me just auto-complete so I can show the end result. And this might take, say, 30 decisions. I've got very good accuracy. Let's go to our results. So there's a quick summary of the weights that came out. Remember, they all started off at 25%. So on the basis of how I was answering those questions, but of course I wasn't doing it seriously, I'm putting most of my weight on the investigators and the least on the significance. To tell you the truth, probably go the other way, but that's another story. And here are those numbers in more detail. Here they all are here. Remember, they all started off at 25, and notice that they're spreading out. And so there's that linearity, again, just based on my answers to those questions, is determining the weights that are emerging. And there's lots of ways to see the same results. Some people like graphical, not everyone's into numbers. And we can say things like, for example, the investigators getting a weight overall of 39.4 relative to the least important thing, 16.4. The ratio of those two things, one is 2.4 times as important as the other, and so on and so forth. We can see it graphically. Now, as much fun as that is, here's the results. So here they are, all 40 of them, with their descriptions over here, based on those scores that we just saw, or the weights. They're all added up, and now they're scored between 100, and they're ranked, of course, according to that. And poor old 457 is poor on everything, so it's getting nothing. So now everything's everything's spread across that range. And I didn't show you, when I entered it, but it's very easy to do this. I put in these other considerations, so the amount of money that they're asking, maybe the confidence in budget, strategic importance. Again, could be anything, whatever your interests are, and it's very simple to do. Just create them like this. So I've done that. And what I want to do, of course, is we'll try and allocate a budget across all of these things. So, if I was just working down this list, and you've got to get the commas in the right place, but that's $4.3 million for that application, followed by one for $1.3 million. There's some really relatively cheap ones down here that maybe aren't quite as good, but I can now start to think about value for money. And so a nice way to do that is in a graph like this, in the value for money chart. And so here they are presented, make it a little bit smaller. Here they are presented on the, it's not helping, on the axis is the score out of 100 and the money along the horizontal. And of course, there's the sweet spot up there. And that's sort of deliberately like traffic lights. The sweet spot, there's some really expensive but not very good ones down here. And if we had enough budget, we'd probably think about the amber as well. And we can show other things too. So maybe confidence in the budget, the bigger the bubble, the more confidence we have maybe. Maybe we want to show strategic importance. And we can start to turn things on and off. Maybe just show me the ones with strategic importance. And so I can really start to zoom in and focus on things that I think are important. And of course, now I can start to allocate a budget. So, and here they all are here down the bottom. If I was to fund them all, again, to get the commas in the right place, this would come in at about $97 million. So let's say my budget, I'm thinking in Australian terms, this is not New Zealand terms. We're a tiny wee country compared to you guys. here's my $50 million, and now I'm going to start spending some money. So again, we do this with deliberation, we'd involve the group, we'd talk about it. So maybe I want to choose this one. It's very high on the benefits and it's relatively cheap compared to other ones. It's the 96 out of 100. So I might select it. And maybe I'll choose another one. Of course, you wouldn't do it as fast as this. And maybe I'll reject a few so I can come at it from another end. Like this one's really expensive. It's not very good. We can reject it. And of course, we do sensitivity analysis, see what difference it would make if we'd rated them a little bit more generously or not so generously to see if, the ones that are marginal. But now I'm starting to see them, I've chosen those ones down here. I've rejected one and I've just spent $2.5 million, which leaves me with a little bit of change from $4.74 million, $447 million rather. So I can start to see where my money's going and do this in a way that the whole idea is to be collaborative and participatory and transparent and everything's above board. I won't show you, but of course everything's recorded in audit reports just because they're keystrokes. It's very easy in software. And I can start to do things like I can filter, for example, only show me, I might say, well, we've got a limited budget here. So what's our range of money? So we had some really expensive ones here in the 4 million range. So maybe we're only going to look at ones that are coming in at less than, I don't know, maybe 2 million. And so we could filter. And so, of course, we're just looking at those ones that meet that requirement. And we could zoom, perhaps just look at those ones over here, for example. The whole point is we can do things live. We're not saying we'll do the analysis and come back and look at this and, next week or something like this. We're doing it in Excel. We could export to Excel if we want to. But we've got a great opportunity here for transparency, which, again, just makes things, I think, very flexible and inclusive, as I said. That's the whole point. Another thing that people do, I'm sure Acta's been thinking about this, is if you think about the ratio of the vertical axis, which is sort of measuring the benefit on the criteria and score out of 100, and the cost along the horizontal, you can think of the y-axis divided by the x-axis as giving us a benefit cost ratio equivalent in these terms. And we can start to choose things on that basis, for example. That's very common. So again, heaps and heaps of flexibility. And I'm just about to end. My time's almost up, I know. So I won't go and do other examples, but I'll again just go back to my folder here. There's plenty of others. We could do the same thing for research questions. Again, probably different criteria, but again, a whole bunch of trade-offs with different criteria included. And of course, out the other end, we get a ranking now of research questions. So there we go. I think that's probably a pretty good point for me to stop.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
It's a really good package and a great demonstration. There's a couple of questions in the chat. We'll come to them later. It's fantastic. So we're going to move on to Professor Haitham Tafaha, and great pleasure in introducing Haitham. He's a Principal Research Fellow at the Centre for Business and Economics of Health at the University of Queensland. He leads the Health Technology Assessment team there, and his research involves economic evaluation of health intervention. He pioneers the application of value of information analysis in Australia as a novel approach to inform early reimbursement decisions and to design efficient and adaptive clinical trials that maximise return on research and investment. So I've once again got pleasure in introducing Haitham as a former PhD student. I was a supervisor, so it's a great way to join things up. So welcome, Haitham, and Haitham's going to present on Acta's work around the survey, the Discrete Choice Experiment survey using 1000 Minds software. Over to you, Haitham.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the kind introduction. I just realized that Paul Hansen was one of your supervisors, so technically he's my grand supervisor, if you are my supervisor. Thank you again for the kind introduction. And in the coming 15 minutes or so, I'll be talking about how we used 1000 Minds software to derive and elicit the weights for the criteria that we developed as part of Group F for Acta. I would like to stop here and thank all the people who have been involved in this important work, particularly the members of Acta Group F, Research Prioritization Tools and Criteria, and also all the participants who participated in the Discrete Choice Experiment Survey and their organizations. So this is what Rachel has presented in a few minutes ago when she discussed how we identified criteria to prioritize research proposals and research questions. And the key 4 categories were, as we saw, relevance, which represent to which extent equity, disease burden, knowledge gaps, and stakeholders' needs were considered. Appropriateness, which is mainly around scientific rigor and the answerability of the research question. Significance, it is what we will get out of that research and societal benefits, and feasibility, whether or not we can achieve, we can conduct that research study. We know that those criteria are widely used, and for many of us who have served on review panels as experts and as peers, we know that we use criteria to prioritize research proposals for funding. And most of the time we use certain weights, and those weights are meant to reflect the importance and significance of the criteria from the perspective of the decision maker or the funder. Unfortunately, we didn't have any empirically derived weights to allow the calculation of a weighted average score across these criteria. And therefore, the aim of this project, this study, was to derive those weights, and then we would be able to understand the preferences and the trade-offs that Australian stakeholders make when they consider those criteria, which will allow us to use them in our research prioritization framework, either to prioritize research questions or proposals. So what we did, it was just a straight application of what Paul Hansen has just presented. So we used 1,000 miles software to develop a discrete choice experiment survey, which was administered online. We aimed to target around 200, to recruit 200 participants representing consumers, researchers, and funders. And those participants were identified through Acta networks, including affiliate organizations and also individual researchers and consumers. We piloted that survey. We made sure that it's fit for purpose and it is clear to participants before we posted that survey live in collaboration with 1,000 Miles team. As has Paul just explained, in using the software, the participants were presented with a series of hypothetical scenarios of research proposals, and they were asked to choose between 2 competing alternatives. So it's a pairwise comparison. And the alternatives consist of a combination of research prioritization criteria. So we used the 4 criteria that we identified, and those have been scored using 3 levels: low, representing a poor score; medium, which is an average score; and high is an excellent score. And the choices made by participants would represent their preferences and the trade-offs they make when they choose between different criteria. So this is an example of the questions that the participants saw when they undertook the survey. So for the hypothetical proposal to the left, we asked them if they prefer an application or a proposal with high relevance but low feasibility, and to the right was the other options. It's the opposite, where we have low relevance but high feasibility. Of course, they have the choice of saying they were equal, and through a series of similar questions, and the process is adaptive. So the software will train itself to the sort of answers, and it would create a new set of questions to that participant. And eventually, the software will be able to tell us the weights and the preferences of the participants who undertook the survey. Now, looking at the results, well, the participation exceeded our expectations. We had 332 respondents. More than 50% of them, 53%, were consumers, 41% were researchers, and 41%, yes, were researchers, and 6% were funders. Interestingly, about 50% of included researchers were clinicians, and the participants were really well informed about research and to some extent about research prioritization, because 60% of researchers had more than 10 years of experience, and almost the same, or 55% of consumers were involved in one way or another in clinical trials, either as participants or they contributed to the design of the clinical trials. Now, looking at the overall weights derived from the three groups, the researchers, consumers, researchers, and funders, as you can see, the criterion with the highest weight was appropriateness, which is, again, the scientific merits of the proposal. And then this was followed by significance and relevance with 26% and 25% respectively. They're really close, but feasibility actually scored relatively low at 21%. So these were the results across the full cohort, the three groups of participants. Looking further into the differences between the groups, we couldn't find any statistically significant differences, except for the difference in the weight for the criterion of relevance between consumers and researchers. Otherwise, as you can see, there were no statistically significant difference. Of course, the sample size sometimes may not help us to identify that difference. But if you look at the actual scores, they were really close to each other. Researchers and consumers, they tend to score appropriateness, which is the scientific merits, relatively high. Likewise, but with surprisingly, I would say, researchers and consumers ranked significance or the impact of research higher than what the funders did. However, again, these figures, because of the sample sizes, the differences, I think they're really slight, and they're close, and the scores are close to each other. Also, we looked at the demographics of the participants to see if, for example, their previous experience or field of research, or their knowledge about clinical trials or research prioritization have influenced their answers and the weights derived. But we couldn't see any relationship between researcher characteristics and the weighting of the attributes or the criteria. We also didn't see any difference in the ways that could be attributed in the case of consumers to their participation or previous participation in research study, or their experience working with researchers to design studies. Of course, this work has its limitations. It was difficult for us to look at the actual response rate because of the, I would say, snowballing approach that we followed in disseminating the survey. The other issue was we had some missing responses, especially amongst consumers, and this might have biased observations. But the software had a mechanism, of course, to adjust for this. The other observation was the number of respondents who identified themselves as funders may be insufficient actually to draw strong conclusions. We only had relatively small number of funders compared with consumers and researchers. The implications of this work, well, the proposed approach that is based on multi-criteria decision-making can be implemented now with the ways that we have derived for the 4 criteria that we identified in Acta Research Prioritisation Framework. And this will allow researchers, CTNs, and funders to transparently, objectively assess those applications and score them. And as you can see in the example to the right, where we have 5 hypothetical proposals, scoring them on a Likert scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is a poor score, 5 is an excellent score, and applying the weights of the 4 criteria and calculating the weighted average at the end, we will be able to prioritize those proposals. And in this example, we have proposal 2 as a preferred option with the highest weighted average score. With the support of 1,000 Miles, which we'll be talking later about its license and how you can access the software through Acta. This will facilitate the way we calculate the weighted average score, and we rank proposals that we consider either to develop research applications or to assess applications for funding. The other good thing is we've noticed that there are minimal differences in attribute weights across stakeholder groups. And this is where the question about whose weights and whose perspective we want to adopt. But here, because the differences were really small, so we think using those weights in the aggregate form would be reasonable. And of course, as Paul has mentioned, if you want to derive your own weights to reflect your stakeholders or organizations' preferences, this is something that you can do using 1,000 Miles. So I would like to stop here and to provide some concluding remarks. So I would like to highlight that this is the first empirical study to elicit research prioritization criteria weights. And those weights reflect Australian stakeholders' preferences and trade-offs between criteria. And these weights could be used to score and rank research questions, topics, and proposals. Thank you very much for listening, and I will hand over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Haytham. Very interesting. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, so I will encourage people to use the chat to pose their questions. We do have 20 minutes or so for question and answer time, and there's a couple in there already. So I guess I'll start with the one I saw first, was probably for you, Rachel. Are topics and proposals scored and weighted using the same selection criteria?
Topics and proposals. Yeah, that's a good question. Often at the topic level, the most important criteria there are about relevance. So, you know, why should we do this? Why should we do research on, you know, stillbirths, for instance? What's the burden of the disease? Are there equity considerations? Is there a big knowledge gap? And also the criterion of significance. What are we going to get out of it by doing trials or research studies in this area, including what's going to be the impact, building capacity and innovation. So relevance and significance are particularly important at the topic, determining which topics to answer. And to some extent, elements of appropriateness might be as well, but appropriateness and feasibility, and then if you go down to the value for money, really are more geared towards the proposal level, where you have a particular design or a concept and you have the details around what you're going to do and what, for instance, the statistical considerations are. I hope that helps.
Thanks, Rachel. Next one on the list was around NHMRC and scoring. Really a comment saying it would be nice if the NHMRC had a tool or used this tool to be able to rank and score grants, including leadership grants and so forth for their decision making. I really think that's the next step, and if we can do something to encourage funding bodies like the NHMRC and the ARC, MRWF to use this would be really useful. But I think following on from your previous question, Rachel, and you might be able to answer this, Haytham, is really, should the same criteria be used across all the grants, or should there be a separate experiment or different weights used for different types of grants?
I could make a quick comment, I think, on that. We set out to look at, criteria from a funder's perspective as well as from a researcher's, trialist, and consumer's perspective. I think the NHMRC, per se, doesn't score our grants. We do, as peers of each other. And so we might be focusing on perhaps the framework to be used in a grant review panel that would, change the criteria and the weighting from those that currently exist in schemes. I think the funders are also really interested in the value for money criterion, and that is likely to be something that's of interest. And we've had some preliminary discussions with a range of people within NHMRC and MRFF. Haytham might like to talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, so we'll, yes, thanks, Rachel, thanks, Paul. So we'll, so just to add to Rachel's answer, so these criteria that we've reported, the four of them, are major categories, and under each main criterion, there are sub-criteria. So for example, when we say relevance, that is the alignment with organizational objectives, stakeholders, maybe aims, objectives. Also, it relates to equity and relates to barrier of disease and knowledge gap. So there, in our framework, in Acta's framework, we put some details around the criteria and the sub-criteria. And it's up to the organization, the funders, and also it depends on the scheme to choose the criteria that is relevant and most appropriate for assessment. Value for money is something that we will be covered in the next workshop, and we hope that this will be something that is also considered alongside other criteria describing the merits of research.
Thank you, Haytham and Rachel. A couple of questions for Paul Hanson here. So first one, Paul, someone says, thank you so much for speaking clearly and making a complex area understandable. The question is, are there examples of studies evaluating your method or software in decision-making compared to standard decision-making method? I'm not quite sure what standard decision-making is.
I know what the person means. So yes, and in fact, usually when we run a process, the standard decision-making methods, if by that people mean sort of using the intuitive, unaided decision-making, like, sitting, reading, thinking, just using our expertise, usually our method runs side by side that method, at least at the start, to give the participants confidence, and also, in fact, to reveal to the participants sort of how variable, and the idea of it's called a noise audit. We'll maybe make these links available, but that book by Daniel Kahneman recommends doing exactly that. Do the standard method, reveal the variability, the noisiness of decision making, and compare that against these other more formal algorithmic methods. And usually, I mean, of course, I'm biased a little bit, but don't take my word for it, take Kahneman's word for it. The algorithmic methods tend to very much dominate the so-called traditional methods. And to be honest with you, particularly when we've been working with clinicians, as you'd expect, they're very wedded to their traditional methods, which, you know, I have absolute respect for because they are the experts. So they often need a bit of convincing that they can do better than just relying on their intuition. So and oftentimes you have to break down that barrier. There's almost a distrust of these methods because that's not how we've always done it. You know, what are you saying? I need help doing this. For 30 years, I've been making tough decisions. Why would I need a tool to help with that? But once people sort of relax into it, they find that they have much better results typically. It's a great question though. It's the right question because, you know, you should be suspicious of new methods.
Too right. Thanks, Paul. A couple of others here, mostly for you, Paul, coming up. So someone says it's a powerful tool, but we need to be clear about interests and biases of people answering the questions to train the model. So if you've got a group of 10, 1 consumer, 9 clinicians, or the other way around, you could get different prioritization. How do you handle it?
Yeah, no, so absolutely. So you always have to recognize that it's only as good as the people that you're asking, but in many cases, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to capture those different viewpoints and bring them together and surface them so that they can be discussed and at least made explicit. And then it really comes down to, you know, what do you want to do with those differences? Do you want to amalgamate, or do you want to perhaps have just one group? You know, maybe patients have a stronger input because it's about them, but then again, in other applications, you'd want to just involve the clinicians in some decisions because they have the expertise. Do you want to take an average of those things? Do you want to have a discussion of those things? And it also very much related to the question, it comes down to really good moderation. So if you are running a session that's a live thing, you know, the person running it, there's a lot of responsibility on them to ensure that those voices are heard. And so I absolutely agree with the comment. But again, it's great to be explicit about those things and try and do something positive about them.
Too right. So has your software been used for making decisions around COVID-19 vaccination?
About vaccination, yes. In Tunisia, a group there have done work using 1,000 Minds to create a tool for vaccination decisions because they're not vaccinating the whole population in Tunisia because they can't afford it. So they created a model using 1,000 Minds. I don't know if they've released it, but they're socializing it amongst the Ministry of Health. We haven't had to in New Zealand, probably not in Australia either, but as I mentioned at the start, we certainly did, literally as we're going into the first lockdown in March, we were by Zoom with ICU professionals creating a tool for the decision about who gets a ventilator. Where I live, there's 150,000 people, there are 6 ventilators. And so, you know, what are you going to do when there's 600 people trying to get into the ICU? You know, that was a real eye-opener for me as a non-medical person.
Tough choices. Yep.
Yeah.
Rachel, question for you. In the framework, are the consumer representatives included in the leadership team?
Sure, thanks for that question. If a clinical trial network is embarking on this process and forming a leadership team, then they would want to ensure that there's wide stakeholder engagement. Many clinical trial networks already have consumers within the leadership of the group, and so it would follow on from that consumer voice is very important in research prioritization. I guess it's not for us to dictate, but the literature and the qualitative work that we did, you know, strongly supported that all relevant stakeholders were included, and so it would make sense at the leadership level to at least have representation from consumers in that. And there are a couple of groups that actively do that. One I could point out, and it might be good to make contact with that group specifically, is ANZMUSC, the Musculoskeletal Trials Group. So they've formed a way of, you know, of how they do this formally. So yeah, I don't see why not.
Thank you. Yeah, and certainly it's taxpayer money for research grants, so we've got to have the taxpayers involved, and that's one way to do it. So fantastic. Question for you, Paul. Is there a way in 1000 Minds to combine methods that include quantitative data methods with paprika?
Yeah, I was going to try and answer that in the chat, but I'm not quite sure what Bruce means by quantitative data. I mean, certainly, in fact, the inputs to paprika oftentimes are quantitative. They needn't be qualitative. It's just whatever the criteria are measured in. The cost is quantitative data. You often use grade, for example, for clinical evidence in other applications. Some of the inputs are cost utility analyses, again, probably not maybe in research prioritization, but in general, yes. Yes.
Yep, for sure. There's one other question previously about, is there a minimum number of questions in 1000 Minds that need to be asked?
No, but the more criteria that you add and the more levels, and Hatham and Rachel probably experience this, and you too, Paul, the more questions you get. It's an exponential problem. So typically, most people probably wouldn't use more than, say, 8 criteria with 4 or 5 levels, because then it just gets so large. It's not that the mathematics doesn't work, it's just that the humans get tired of answering the questions. And so if the survey is going out to run-of-the-mill people, general public, you might not want to give them more than 20 questions, so you probably want to limit to 4 criteria, 5. But if you've got a dedicated group who are prepared to put in, say, an hour doing it, or half an hour even, you could probably go to that limit of 8 or so. It's really just a sort of, it just depends on what the human element is. It's not so much the computational element.
Yeah, totally agree. And some of the choices can be really difficult. I remember doing this with a couple of people, senior people in Queensland Health, and they said, it did my head in. He said, making those trade-offs, it's just the difference is so tough sometimes. It depends on the questions and what you're trying to drill into and how deep you need to drill into it. So I suppose.
Well, sort of too, Paul. I mean, that's what life is, though, right? It's the trade-offs.
Yes.
It's not a tough choice when there's no trade-offs.
Yeah. So when your girlfriend says, do you want a beer or a wine? Well, that's fairly distinctive things. If she said, do you want I don't know, a couple of 2 different lagers, for example, which one would you go for? It's fine.
Yeah. Well, I'm still going for both.
Way to go.
No, you're right.
Yeah. So another question there. What has been the reception of this system from bioethicists or Maori, Indigenous people? If this decision-making tool is being developed, to distribute limited resource.
Oh, Chris, that's a cracker question. So for the ICU thing, it was highly controversial, and I've written several papers on this. There was a lot of pushback, and so basically it came down to ring fencing for different groups. It wasn't just Maori, by the way, too. It was frontline workers, for example, their prior claim. But certainly in New Zealand, you're absolutely right. The issue of Indigenous people, but also Pacific Islands people, not for indigeneity, but for poorer health status comes into it. One easy solution is to have that as a criterion, recognising those equity things. But in the case of New Zealand, there's bigger issues than that, absolutely. And it's to do with the First Nations and stuff like that, which I think is in Australia as well. The bioethicists have been all over it for the last 20 years, and there's lots of reports written. I'm happy to share stuff on that. Some were initially skeptical, but they all came down to the basic conclusion that most economists would, that these tough decisions are being made, have to be made. The question is not, can we avoid the decisions, because we can't. The question is, can we do them in a better way, and especially that's more transparent and explicit and auditable and defensible and understandable, all those things that on the whole bioethicists are in favour of. It doesn't get rid of the scarcity problem or the toughness of having to make a choice, but the hope is that it makes it in a better way that includes people and allows representation of these often marginalized groups. And again, that comes down to who's running the process. It's not the tool, it's the people using the tool. Any tool can be used for bad as well as good.
Absolutely. I think it's relatively easy in 1000 Minds to have another criteria around Indigenous status.
Yeah.
Should Indigenous people get a high priority, yes or no? And there's trade-offs around that, and you can tease out what the general public or what your sample think is appropriate weighting for Indigenous people.
And also in this work that Hatham and Rachel and you, Paul, doing, running a discrete choice experiment on different, vast numbers of people potentially, you can test whether different people have different priorities, and you can formally examine that and do things like cluster analysis to see if different groups, sit out as little segments because they have different concerns and different needs and different priorities. We can measure that stuff. We can see to what extent those group identities mean something, or in fact, are we mainly just idiosyncratic, which is often the case in my experience. We have apparently, identifiable characteristics, but when it comes to our tastes, oftentimes people who seem to be very different may have very similar tastes and vice versa. We don't know, but we've got a chance to test these things, and that's why this whole area is often called choice modeling. We can model choices.
Too right. I think our questions are coming. That's absolutely right. That's great stuff. I think our questions have come to an end, but just to raise a point to the audience that there's still places available at the next prioritisation workshop on Thursday, 12:30 till 2. That workshop coming up will include theory, tools and guidance on how to do formal research prioritisation, and there's a link in the chat to register for that if you haven't already registered. So I think I'll draw it to a close there unless there's any last minute burning questions. And nothing's happening in the chat, so I'm going to say thank you everybody for attending, and big thank you to all our speakers. I think I did have one more slide. There's going to be, you've already put it in there, Paul, about how to access 1000 Minds software. There's the Acta annual scientific meeting to be held on 10th to the 12th of November. I think that's in Sydney. And hence, I was going to mention the workshop on Thursday. So thank you, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. And big thanks to all our speakers and to Acta for arranging this.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
See you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheery.
We'll just wait for people to close their link. Looks like some are multitasking. Then we'll have a brief debrief.
Nice job, cheering. You did a great job.
Thanks,
a lot of balls up here, eh? A lot of balls.
Good fun.
Yeah, I think Rachel has left.
Everyone, yeah, Rachel stepped off, but thank you everyone so much. I think that first one went really well, and it set us up well for the second one on Thursday. Yeah, has anyone got any comments or questions?
What are we doing on Thursday? I mean, I know we are, but is it, what's the, what are we going to talk about?
Yeah, so the one on Thursday, that will